Hello, viewers. I am Qamar Cheema with my YouTube channel, Qamar Cheema. And viewers, today I have an honor to have my good friend, Professor John Blaxland from Australian National University. Professor John has a huge career and he has been doing a lot of work. There's a lot of things which I can explain. Currently, he's teaching he's a professor of international security and intelligence studies, and he's a former head of the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University. His area of interest are intelligence, cyber and security, Australian military history and strategy, Indo-Pacific, military operations in Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and a huge list I can explain. But while starting my discussion, first of all, I will say thank you very much, Professor, for your time.
Thanks for having me on the program, Qamar. Great to be with you again.
Thank you. Professor, while we're talking, we have seen that a new world order is being written in Indo-Pacific, and all the great powers are competing for their influence in the region. And we have seen that how recently the great powers have been on the table. Even the Chinese and the Americans, they have just taken off their gloves in Alaska a couple of days ago. And we've also find that multilateralism is back in the world. And we find that how the Australia and India are going to be the major players, and much of the history of the international politics will, in coming decades, will be written in Indo-Pacific. So, Professor, just starting my question, first of all, how do you see this new world order which is being written in Indo-Pacific?
Well, thanks very much, Qamar. Look, it's interesting you use the term the New World Order, because that was what George H.W. Bush used at the end of the Cold War, when it looked like the unipolar moment when the United States had emerged triumphant, leading the West and the democracies in the fight against communism, the Soviet model of communism, and it was a triumphant moment for the West, and particularly for the United States. I don't think we're quite in that situation today. Arguably, it's more of a new world disorder. And this, with great powers and various middle powers like Pakistan and Australia, muddling along, trying to make sense and make the best of a situation that's in quite a lot of flux, quite a lot of shifting sands, if you like, as we see. We go from the Trump era to the new Biden era and the extended Xi era in China, where we see the competition, what we saw as a spike in competition in the Trump years, followed up with what appears to be more continuity than change when it comes to the Biden administration. Certainly, if you go by the rhetoric that emerged from the 2+2 summit in Alaska in recent days. So New World Order, I put a big question mark at the end of that one, Qamar. I'm not so sure. What I'm seeing is states scrambling, looking around to try and come up with a semblance of order to compensate for the shifting sands and mitigate the risks associated with the unraveling, if you like, of the order that we've come to know and love, that has stood us in such good stead for the last few decades, and that we for a long time took for granted. And in the case of Australia and other countries involved in operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, we thought that was the main game. And while we were focused on that, all of a sudden we realized, lo and behold, there were other real issues, substantial issues about great power contestation, let alone looming environmental catastrophe, that were going to occupy our minds. And I say looming environmental catastrophe as we in Australia here are experiencing unprecedented floods only a year after unprecedented fires and drought. So, it's really, we're living in that cursed term, the interesting times that we are experiencing at the moment.
Yes, thank you very much for this initial comments. But Professor, do you really think that when we were in our previous conversation, we also spoke that during the Trump era, the ideational leadership was gone in the United States. Do you think that America is back? Because what I was hearing to the Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and he was saying that in his meeting with his Chinese counterparts, that he was in Japan and he was in Korea, and our allies, their allies, I mean Anthony's ally, they were happy that America is back leading. So do you think the multilateralism is back, and do you think that the America's ideational leadership is back?
Well, that's a good question, Qamar, because ideational leadership is something, as we discussed last time, has been seriously lacking for a while now from the United States. My concern is, though, that it's not easy for them to just come back straight away. Everybody kind of wants them to be back, but there remains considerable skepticism about how the United States can be postured to make that an enduring phenomenon. What happened with the Trump administration is not something that the outcome of the last US election guarantees that it won't happen again. I mean, elections come and go, and that one was more, finely balanced than many external observers really were all that comfortable with acknowledging. So, yes, on one level, the Biden administration is trying to bring America back. The tour of the Northeast Asian allies has certainly been welcome. The posturing and engagement with China is welcome as well. And the rhetoric from an Australian point of view has been reassuring. But the concern is that the fundamentals are still quite significantly weaker than they were 4 years ago. And one of the things that strikes me particularly about this is that when we talk about America being back, it's back from what and to where. And it's not quite where it was, in part because China is not where it was. The world has moved on, and we're in a different set of circumstances today than we were back in 2016. Today, China is much more economically and militarily powerful. The internal pressures continue. Internal challenges, no doubt, are growing, but actually complementing that is a stark rise in its bellicosity in its language. The sharp power diplomacy, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, is really disconcerting. Even Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, who 4 years ago, a bit over 4 years ago now, basically went out of his way to be extremely accommodating towards President Xi in China. The Philippines has been recently facing a torrent of intrusive actions by Chinese maritime militia and fleets, fishing fleets and Coast Guard vessels. That goes to show you that regardless of how much a country might wish to be accommodating towards China, the bottom line is that they don't want to be just accommodated. They want really to be shown incredible deference, and they want to control. They want to control the South China Sea especially, but it's not at all clear that that's where they want to stop. And that's, I think, one of the most disconcerting things, which is driving this desire for the Quad countries to act together in a way that a decade ago seemed highly implausible, particularly when then Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, pulled out of the Quad, in part because out of a desire to be accommodating towards China. Look where it got us. It got us nowhere. So there is now a real sense that these countries are looking to, in trying to establish, using your terms, that new world order. It's a fractious competitive space. It's less ordered than we were accustomed to in the past. It's much more combative, and it's fractious. And of course, it's some very, very tinder dry flashpoints around the world, and some of them which my colleague Brendan Taylor's written about in his book, The Four Flashpoints: Korean Peninsula, East China Sea, South China Sea, and Taiwan. Then, of course, there's also the issue of the line of actual control in the Himalayas, let alone a swag of other issues that have generated considerable angst, real concern about what China might be doing next and whether or not its actions have benign intentions. And demonstrably, that's increasingly looking less the case.
Okay. Well, Professor, the students here in India and Pakistan, they would love to learn from you that how do you see Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue? Because much of the discussion which is going on media, on social media, much of the time which is being consumed by the writers, thinkers, that is on this Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And the momentum which has come with the President Biden's being in office, and how the you have seen that the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense of the United States, they first landed in Japan, and they're putting a lot of money. So, and I was also looking that the Americans are asking for more funds from the Defense Department is asking for more funds because they have to compete with China. So, how do you see this Quad, and what does this mean for the countries like Pakistan and India? India is direct partner of this, but how do you see this all development?
Yeah, thanks, Qamar. Look, it is a very interesting development. It is the big topic at the moment. What does the Quad mean? And there is, as you very ably pointed out, there's quite a debate at the moment about what it really does mean and what the implications are. We're seeing certainly from the United States a remarkable enthusiasm for this construct. Kurt Campbell, I think, has a bit to answer for. You know, I think he can claim a certain degree of responsibility for seeing the merits of following up on this policy that was developed under the previous administration. Biden taking the reins on this is very significant. There was a sense prior to him coming to office that he wasn't going to show as much interest in the Quad, in part because he's a Democrat, and the Prime Minister of India and Australia tend to be more conservatives, and of Japan for that matter. So there wasn't seen to be the potential for much political chemistry, if you like, between the four national leaders. What's happened, though, is that they've recognised that the national interest of those four countries is overlapping at the moment to an unprecedented degree. Now, they all have different perspectives. India, of course, its major concern is on the line of actual control and its northern border with the Himalayas. Now, obviously, it's very heartening. Actually, Qamar, I commend you for your work in being an advocate for Pakistan, India, normalisation and improvement in relations, which we can all hope for. It's certainly something to be commended, and I commend you for what you've done in that space. I think, though, that for India, the challenge is now not just in the Himalayas, but the assertion of Chinese influence in and around the Indian Ocean in a way that is a challenge to India's influence in its domain in the Bay of Bengal, in the Indian Ocean more broadly, with Sri Lanka, with Bangladesh, with Nepal, with Bhutan, and so on. The challenge is that there's a certain degree of salami slicing going on here from China. Very, in one sense, quite clever play of their strategy, but on another level, a strategy that's a remarkably, as I say, it's kind of this sharp power approach that is causing considerable offence. And driving India into the arms of the Quad, into the arms of the United States. Interestingly, Japan and India have for quite some time now seen eye to eye on the need to coordinate their actions and their policy positions in response to China. But we've seen an elevation. There's been a significant elevation with the heads of the nations, the four nations' governments engaging in a way, addressing the most immediate issue, of course, COVID-19, with their plan for a rollout of a vaccine where they collaborate effectively. What, to my mind, this points to is the future of increased collaboration across a whole range of areas. And here I'm thinking particularly in terms of cybersecurity. We know, for instance, that China's been a very aggressive player in terms of cyber attacks, cyber intrusion and foreign interference in India, in Australia, and elsewhere, in the United States as well, and Japan. So collaborating, coordinating, deconflicting, and making sure their messages are working in sync together is an area of probable and increased cooperation. Interestingly, the Trump administration, we talk about their retreat from ideational leadership. One of the things that, the United States was famous for was the the leading role it played in establishing international institutions at the end of the Second World War. The United Nations itself, housed in New York, that's no accident. That's a deliberate policy of the United States to play a leading role in this space, and the range of other related institutions, World Health Organization, trade organizations, IMF, banking, all sorts of educational, UNESCO, etc., bodies that are international, that the United States has effectively walked away from and ceded much of that space to China to dominate. Now, China doesn't completely dominate, but has a disproportionate influence in that space, despite its limited contribution financially to the UN and its obviously limited vote. So there's, I think, space for these four countries to cooperate in pushing back in that space and seeking to assert themselves, particularly because of Biden's interest in international institutions, to push back in terms of the governance of these institutions to make sure that they are actually for the world and not just for China. And so that's something that I think we will see more of. There remains, I think, a degree of skepticism in Australia, some hope, but skepticism about whether or not India can overcome its domestic, immense domestic challenges to have an external perspective where where the utility of engaging with Australia, from our perspective, that's the most important, but obviously the United States and Japan as well, is maintained because, we can see that the pressures, the domestic political pressures inside India make that challenge greater. Interestingly enough, of course, the domestic politics of India itself leave the country open to charges of being less than completely liberal, as a liberal democracy would want to be. Now, so I think one of the issues here is the rhetoric when we talk about the Quad. It's about liberal liberal democracies, open liberal democracies. I think we need to be realistic and recognise that there is a degree of pragmatism here. This is about national interests overlapping and a desire for them to not be taken to the cleaners by Chinese cyber attacks, by Chinese foreign interference, and by Chinese military dominance in and around their spaces. So these countries, all four countries, have agency. It's very interesting, the quite shrill response to the Blinken statement in Alaska recently, the extended pontificating by their Chinese counterparts in a way that, to my mind, there's a great Shakespearean line where he says, he thinks he doth protest too much. In other words, the level of protestation was about a smokescreen hiding a sense of guilt and of vulnerability. And I suspect that is probably the case in terms of China's position, because geostrategically, China isn't in a very strong place. It is surrounded by these countries to a large extent. It does resent the fact that they can hem in China. And China feels its vulnerabilities, its line of communications via the sea, it's the vulnerability of the Malacca Strait, its strategic jugular vein, if you like, the fact that most of its oil and resources are imported through that strait and across the Indian Ocean, down the tip of India, makes it quite vulnerable in a way that no other great power is vulnerable. No other great power faces those kinds of vulnerabilities, except perhaps Japan. But essentially, there's for a country of 1.3 to 1.4 billion people that is aspiring to reassert itself, if you like, as the so-called Middle Kingdom, these are galling constraints that the Quad countries are imposing, generating this kind of almost over the top, frothing at the mouth anger that's quite barbed in its so-called diplomacy. I mean, you can barely call it diplomacy. It's quite obnoxious, the language being used.
Yeah, Professor, it's a wonderful analysis, but I want to stick to India for some more time, and then I will come on Australia as well. You have mentioned about the India's domestic challenges, and I was just looking at the Freedom House, American think tank, just recently said that India has moved from free to partially free in terms of its democracy. But okay, that's fine. But don't you think that for West, particularly the way India is going to modernize itself in terms of its military modernization, they have recently said that in the next 7 8 years they're going to spend about $130 billion for military modernization. This is Indian government is saying. In the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2019, the professor, India was the largest arms importer in the world. So one thing, two things. The third thing is that the international community understand that India is a bright financial spot in terms of economic engagement. So do you really think that the West, particularly United States, and in being in Quad, somehow the Americans and the West will be in a position to balance this? Because India is a financial sport, it's a big military market, at the same time lecturing on democracy, on human rights. How will you balance that?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And one of the things that I think is particularly irritating from an American policy perspective is the fact that India keeps buying Russian equipment, equipment that makes it very difficult to make American purchased equipment compatible because of concerns about security vulnerabilities when you try and integrate your forces and the communication systems, especially in networks between American-sourced platforms and Russian-sourced platforms. That's caused considerable concern in Turkey, where the S-400 missiles were purchased and led to the United States deciding to cancel the F-35 sale to Turkey. So this is a considerable rub point, but there is also an expectation, a hope, maybe more than an expectation, that India will see its economic growth continue beyond the pandemic, which has seen considerable decline, obviously, but on the other side of the pandemic, that it will recover and that will accelerate. But what we have seen, and this is something evident over the last 2 decades, is that the acceleration has been happening in China, not so much in India. There has been acceleration in India, but it's relatively not nearly as much as with China. So there's been a certain degree of kind of dashed hopes there so far, and there is a hope, I guess, that will be reversed. Another interesting point here, Qamar, is of course that India is sufficiently distant from the United States and Japan and Australia. So there's no obvious rub points between them in terms of their spheres of influence. And so that makes for a nice complementarity between what they are trying to do as they concern how to respond with and engage with, respond to and engage with China. So there's plenty of scope for them to continue to collaborate with each other, engage with each other, find ways to deconflict their messages and work together. So the future economics of India, that's for economists to comment on. I don't claim to have expertise in that field, but from what I see, there is, I think, a degree of confidence that they will recover and that they will pick up speed again. But whether or not they can outpace China is a completely different matter entirely.
Okay. So, Professor, almost the last question to you is about Australia. And that question is that how do you see that how Australia is getting mainstream because of Quad, and how it is getting into this, starting from the Australian continent, going till Africa, and reaching till Asia? How does Australia, there is a feeling in Australia that it is considered that Australia is somehow under the influence of China because of massive investments. So how do you see the role of Australia and how it is getting mainstream because of Quad?
So Chinese investment, actually, relatively speaking, hasn't been that great. Chinese purchasing of our raw materials has been great. There's no question. And interestingly, despite the attempts to kind of punish Australia over beef, wine, barley, etc., and coal, trade with China has been going gangbusters. In fact, trade with the sale of Australian iron ore has almost reached all-time highs with the sale price, with China being the principal purchaser. So, it gets back to this point I've made before, Qamar, is that China doesn't buy from Australia because it likes our liberal Western democracy. It really only does it because it's a good deal. And if it stops being a good deal, it will go elsewhere, or it will stop purchasing entirely. So my sense is that we need to not become Chicken Little here and get panicky about Chinese sanctions and what they might mean for Australia's welfare and Australia's future prosperity. Australia joined the European Economic Community in Britain joined the European Economic Community in the early 1970s, the EU precursor. That was supposed to be calamitous for Australian and New Zealand trade back then, but both Australia and New Zealand have actually prospered remarkably well since Britain did that. And now, of course, Britain's come back and wants to form a trade agreement with Australia and New Zealand again. So my point of that is that I think we need to be fairly level-headed about what the future holds in terms of our relationship with China. We will continue trading with them as best we can on issues that they're prepared to purchase from us, and vice versa. Australians keep purchasing Chinese goods. But what there is at the moment is a real push for diversification, a sense that Australia has been slightly on easy street, if you like, with taking it for granted that the markets would stay the same. Interestingly enough, there's reports that other countries like Germany is experiencing this too, with record sales of their automobiles. Everyone loves German automobiles. But of course, as we're seeing with other industries that have set up business in China, is that there's a real challenge about intellectual property theft and what that means in the long term for China's a desire to basically usurp those capabilities and establish them autonomously, and then cut out the middleman. And of course, that's got enormous implications for all the rest of us, which leaves us in Australia not so concerned, because we don't produce Mercedes-Benz or BMWs, but we have raw materials and primary produce that people want, and we have exports such as education, which is a world-class education system that has been a major export for us, but obviously since COVID-19 has been in a sort of a coma, if you like, and we've been surviving without international students and relying on what we had before, which was just the local domestic student body, which was fine, but it's presenting significant challenges. So the road ahead is one where we're not sure how much the United States can sustain its engagement in this part of the world. It's been very heartening lately. We're a little bit wary about how enthusiastic India might be in maintaining its ties with Australia, and similarly with Japan, because, well, we're all interested in responding and protecting our interests when it comes to our policies with China. There's a real question about how much these four countries actually can help each other, and from a purely zero-sum perspective. Critics, international relations critics, are saying we need to be very, very skeptical of this. My sense is that these four countries, if they look at this with the long term in mind, can see that cooperation trumps narrow self-interest deal making that undermines the Quad. The Quad gives leverage. It helps considerably, in my view, to deter potential additional adventurism from China, particularly economic adventurism and cyber adventurism and potentially military adventurism as its power grows and as it seeks to reach out further into the Indian Ocean, into the Pacific Ocean, to secure its economic and political interests. So that presents a challenge for us all. Those challenges are only going to grow, and that means that you and I, Qamar, are going to be employed for a long time to come.
Yeah. One short comment I need from you, one last short comment from you, and it is about the Indian vaccines and the Chinese vaccine, because I am here in this part of the world. The India thinks that India provides, around 60% of the world's vaccine. And they believe that they have come up with this. There's a great initiative that they're exporting the vaccines. They're giving it to the free for the world. How come? What is the impression in India about? What is the impression in Australia about the Indian vaccine? Because Indians are saying that we are competing with the Chinese on this vaccine thing. So, what is an impression in Australia about this?
Yeah, no, thanks, Qamar. It's very interesting because I think there is a fairly high degree of skepticism about this kind of products coming out of China. And I'm no epidemiologist, so I can't really comment on those with any authority. But I can tell you that my reading of the mood in Australia, as far as that's possible for an observer to do, is a considerable skepticism when it comes to what China's doing, and a real sense of hope, if not optimism, that what's happening with India, the collaborative work that the Quad is doing with the vaccination work through India, is actually something that's very positive, and it's going to help all of us in the end. The bottom line is that there's a huge demand for vaccines globally. We all need to double down on that, and I think there's not enough to go around. So the more that we make, the more that China and the Europeans and the Americans and us all together get to make and share as equitably as possible around the world, the better off we'll all be. The sooner you and I can meet in person and actually shake hands and have this conversation or in person, rather than through looking at a round piece of glass on my laptop computer.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor John, for you sparing the time and enlightening my viewers through your perspectives. Thank you very much for your time, and we really hope that the floods in Australia to get calmed down, and the people of Australia they get a good time, and they were facing a very hard time because of these floods. And I'm sure the government of Australia and the people of Australia are doing a lot of work to save the humanity, and we hope and we wish the best of luck to those who are in trouble.
Thank you very much, Qamar.
Thank you, Professor.